So last time we last time I tried to do a first pass at my overall ethical outlook and si- tried to situate that within this concept of authenticity. And for a first attempt, I think it was okay. I have pretty much in an attempt to be authentic myself, right? I am trying to post videos in a public space where things are not necessarily polished, and I haven't had a lot of practice. And especially with verbally trying to lay out a philosophical idea or a philosophical system or an ethical system that has lived in my head for the better part of a decade in various forms. I think I'm slowly learning how to articulate that. And I think I'm getting hopefully a little bit better, hopefully a little bit clearer as time goes on. But it was the last video was sort of a watershed moment for me in some ways the because I've never really done that before. I suppose I've never really taken time to sort of just deliberately lay out the to deliberately lay out the ethics in a systematic way, I suppose. And I'm tempted to go over it again, right? I'm tempted to kind of take a second pass, and I'm tempted to try to make clearer what I was talking about in that video in this video, because listening back to it, I can see all the mistakes, right? Listening back to it, I can see uh, how much unclarity there is in there. And there's part of me that wants to do it again, right? And do a second pass and keep trying to sort of perfect that video. But I think it's going to be better if I kind of just press forward. I think it's going to be better if I move forward down the chain that I was moving before, where I'm talking about the ideal life and then I'm talking about what goes wrong, how we can fix it. And by doing that, almost try to come to the complete understanding of my philosophy, or complete verbal articulation of my philosophy. Because this right here, this struggle right here that I'm having even right now, I want that to be of a public record, because I don't want to be afraid of having the mistakes out there, and I want the process to be out there, and I want the picture of what it looks like to try to learn how to articulate the ideas that you've been thinking about in an exploratory way. I want those to be out there. I want to share that with people. I am not so much interested in sitting here and presenting a totally perfect and airtight philosophical system to the world, as much as I am interested in sharing, I suppose, my incomplete and poorly articulated thoughts with people, and grow as a result of doing that repeatedly, and get people's criticisms and get people's opposition, and strengthen my own understanding by repeatedly attempting to articulate what I'm talking about and exposing it publicly as an act of authentic process, because this is what it actually looks like to come to understand yourself, come to understand what you think, and come to learn how to articulate it clearly and simply, and in a way that other people can appreciate. The videos themselves are an act of authenticity. The videos themselves are an act of exposure. the videos themselves are an example of many of the main strategies I use to become authentic in my own life, like taking deliberate risks, and doing that thing that you're sort of bodily afraid of, but mentally is going to be fine, right? Like, you're going to survive. And this too, documenting how I'm feeling, right? And documenting the fact that, like quite honestly, I feel nervous talking about it. Quite honestly, I think I'm struggling in some ways to talk about it, and I wrestle with that. I wrestle with, am I going to sound smart enough, right? You know, uh, the people out there who really know philosophy, how are they going to judge this, right? How are they going to judge the thoughts? How are they going to judge the articulation? Do I have the truth, or am I just um, rambling on, right? Is all the time that I've spent thinking about it and writing about it, was that all a waste of time, right? Or is there something of value under here? And you sort of wrestle with those negative thoughts. And again, I want to make this an act of public disclosure, because I think the truth is that nobody comes out of the womb with a fully articulated philosophy that they can just speak to people in the clearest and most profound way. And I'm not even sure if that's what I'm necessarily after, right? I mean, I'm after the truth. I'm after the truth of meaning. I'm after the truth of goodness, and I'm after the truth of what it means to live those things out meaningfully, already knowing that there is the ultimate answer is in Christ, but even philosophically, trying to understand that and possessing an individual understanding and interpretation of that, but at the same time testing that individual interpretation against the world around me, and really just in general learning how to talk about it and articulate it without, I guess, really just trying to understand what I am thinking, or where my mind is leading me, right? And that's a messy process, or at least it's a messy process for me, and it's a bit of a struggle, and it's a struggle for me. So maybe it comes easy to other people. I don't know. But in either way, the only way forward is to repeatedly do this. The only way forward is to continually put myself in this situation where it's uncomfortable, and continually try to articulate my philosophy and my ideas, and, watch this back, try to get clearer, and hopefully, as well as, I guess, the nerves of public exposure settle down, it'll be easier for me to just focus on what I'm talking about, rather than, these explanations of what I'm talking about, right? But I don't want to leave out the explanations, because they are part of the authentic process as much as the ideas are. And so this is a mix of talking about philosophy, talking about my ideas in philosophy, or the conclusions that I've come to, but at the same time, it's a deliberate attempt at authentic exposure. At the same time, it's a deliberate attempt to show you the process of development, and not hiding that, and not hiding the struggles or the fears or the anxieties or the hopes, right? So that's what I'm doing. Um, Going back to the philosophy itself, again, I said, I was tempted to go over the ethics again, but I'm going to resist that temptation and kind of just move forward until I get to the actual end of the process that I outlined in the beginning. And from there, I might just restart or narrow my focus to particular topics. We'll see. But today, the main focus, besides the exposure, is going to be talking about what has gone wrong, what gets in the way of a meaningfully good life. Because we talked about earlier that a meaningfully good life is being able to act for the sake of what you truly value. And when you think about that phrase, acting for the sake of what you truly value, the first thing you might think is, well, don't we do this most of the time? Or don't we do this sort of automatically. I mean, we're always thinking that we're acting for what for the sake of what we value, and maybe we're mistaken about that, but we're always acting for what we think we value. And so, what actually significantly gets in the way of doing that? What gets in the way of living a meaningfully good life? And in the last episode as well, I talked about some of the preconditions for acting for the sake of what you truly value. One being life, in the sense that you need to remain alive in order to act at all, right? To act in the world, you have to be in the world. You have to be alive. I know it sounds redundant, but this is going to get important later on. Precondition of authenticity is life. Another precondition of authenticity is freedom. To act for the sake of what you value, you have to be free to act for the sake of what you value. And more specifically, free from external physical force. Somebody quite literally forcing you to act against what it is that you value in the moment that you're acting for it, right? Now, a distinction that might be useful here is, I mean, this is kind of following Isaiah Berlin, but the distinction between positive and negative freedom. And the distinction is something like negative freedom is freedom from, and positive freedom is freedom to. And I am very much focused on freedom from physical force as a precondition for authenticity or acting for the sake of what you truly value. Not positive freedom, which is the freedom to. So not having all the necessary, advantages or circumstances ready for you to act for the sake of what you value. Which you could say, like, I'm more interested in the negative preconditions for authenticity than the positive preconditions for authenticity. Because the definition of acting for the sake of what you value is acting for the sake of it, not necessarily achieving what you value. And I think positive freedom has more to do with actually achieving the value than it does with acting for the sake of the value. So a more concrete example of this would be something like, in conversations I've had with people before, they'll say like, okay, what if you and I both go for a job, right? You and I both apply for the same kind of job that we really want, that would be of great value to either of us, but only one of us can have the job, right? And let's say we both apply and you get hired instead of me. Is the fact that you got hired, or maybe even that you applied in the first place, isn't that an act of force against me in this context? Because, or at the very least, the boss has used force in only hiring you instead of me. Isn't this an act of force? Because now you've restricted my freedom too, right? You've taken away that job position from me. Now, so now I can't actually be in that position. I can't manifest a value, right? And my response to this is to say that that concern and the various kinds of examples that go along with that has to do with the actual manifestation of the value itself, not the acting for the sake of the value. Meaning, in the situation that we're talking about there was no, you could act for the sake of the value in the sense that you could go and apply for the job, but there was no guarantee that you would manifest the value, which is actually achieving the job. And what I'm concerned with, and what I think is the precondition for authenticity, is the ability to act for the sake of the value, not necessarily to manifest the value itself. Because the manifesting of the value itself can never be a guarantee. It can never be sort of a universal guarantee, because, of course, what people actually value is incredibly diverse. And so, not only incredibly diverse, but oftentimes mutually exclusive. And so, if manifesting the value was of universal value, or manifesting the value was the universal moral standard, then it would be impossible or a moral contradiction. What I'm concerned about here is the ability to act for the sake of one's values, not necessarily, again, the success of that acting for. And but you can have a universal standard for the ability to act, which has to do with negative freedom, the ability to be free from physical force. Um, Whenever force is present, there ends up being a moral contradiction in the sense that the person who uses force wants to be free to use force, but the person who is the victim of force also wants to be free from force. Whenever force is involved, you have a moral contradiction in which one person is saying, I have the right to use force and to be free to use force, and you do not have the right to use force, or you do not have the right to be free. So it's saying, I have the right to be free, but you do not have the right to be free. Whereas a world that is completely absent from force, where all participation is voluntary and there is no physical force, everybody is able to act for the sake of what they value universally. Oh, what gets in the way of living an authentic life? The first thing we can say for sure is one, a threat to life, and two, a lack of freedom. Really, threats to life and the lack of freedom are two different kinds of the same thing with different moral qualities to them. They're actually both manifestations of force with different moral agencies attached. And what I mean is this: life itself sets limits on what we are able to act for. Like, not even talking about human beings for a second and their impact on your life. Even if you were completely by yourself, life would still force limits on what it is that you can actually act for the sake of. The human imagination can readily outstrip what is realistic in order to achieve, right? So a human being might want to live forever, but reality confronts us with death. So it may be, we may want to authentically act for the sake of eternal life, but death forces us not to act for the sake of that, or at the very least, not make that impossible. And so there is something you can call existential force. And existential force is the limitations on what we're actually able to act on because of the situation that we're in, either the world that we live in or our own limitations, right? So like if I'm 5'2", but I want to be a basketball player, the existential conditions of the world, professional basketball player, you could say, combined with some social elements, of course, but the existential conditions of the world may create a limit on what I can pursue. And not only that, but the existential limitations and nature of the world creates destructive force, right? So an example I've used before is something like, I'm out in the middle of Kansas and I build this house, and the authentic act is I want to be able to continue to live in this house. And then a tornado comes around and rips through my house and destroys it. And that act of force by nature, by the world, forces me to act against what I authentically want. I want to live in the house, but now I'm forced not to live in the house because it's destroyed. These kinds of existential or natural forces condition what we're able to even act for in the first place. There is a natural or existential barrier or limit to how we can act depending on who we are, our circumstances, and our values, right? And these don't our limitations do not our limitations as human beings in the world do not map on perfectly, if at all, with what we truly want out of life. And one of the biggest existential limitations or, or conditions is life itself. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but the fact that you have to live. You have to be able to eat, sleep, and rest and maintain your life force long enough for you to actually have the time to pursue the values that you really want. Life is this sort of universal value means that you must constantly sustain in order to achieve what you actually want. And life comes into competition with authenticity. Life comes into competition with acting for the sake of what you want. Because what you really want is to be able to do what you want without having to think about or even putting effort into all the things that are required for life. But you need to live in order to act for the sake of what you want. And so there is a forced precondition on, there's a forced precondition by the existential on your ability to be authentic. And it actually limits your ability to pursue your meaning, to pursue what you truly want. And again, the further we go back in history, the more evident this becomes, where the further we go back, the more and more time had to be devoted to sustaining life rather than living out the meaning of that life. And the further we get back to our own, the present time, especially in Western countries, the more and more time we can devote to pursuing what is actually meaningful to us rather than what we need to do in order to survive. And so the threat of death becomes a controlling factor. The threat of death and the need to sustain life becomes a controlling factor on our authenticity, becomes a limiting factor on our authenticity in a sort of universal way, in the sense that everybody has to deal with it to some extent. Even if you're the richest person on earth, you still have to devote time, energy, resources, and labor to sustaining your life. And that only if you're only concerned with your own life, right? But it is also the fact that life is the precondition for authenticity, such that it has to be satisfied before you can pursue authenticity to begin with. That actually mirrors the force that comes from human beings, right? So in the tornado example, the tornado comes in and destroys your home and forces you to act against what you value. You want to live in the house, but the tornado comes through, it destroys your house, and now you can no longer live there. You have to go live somewhere else. You have to settle for some sort of secondary value. And we consider that to be bad, right? When a tornado comes through and devastates your home and causes you suffering and forces you to act in a way that you don't value, we consider that to be something bad that happened, right? But we don't call it evil because there's no moral agency to it, in the sense that the tornado didn't have a purpose behind destroying your house. It wasn't intentional. And it can't really, it's not conscious, so it can't divert itself, it can't change itself. There's no way to have really prevented it, or at the very least, if there was a way of preventing it, it has to come down to what human beings were doing, not what nature was doing. Nature has no moral agency, therefore we call the event tragic, we call the event bad, but we don't call the tornado evil, right? But the same principle of force applies to human beings. When a human being uses force against another human being, there is a moral agency involved with it, in the sense that the human being has a choice. They can decide to use force, or they can refrain from using force. So if we take the same example of a house, if you have a person who commits arson, they come to your house and they deliberately destroy your house because they, get a kick out of it for whatever reason. Then we don't just call the act bad, we call the act evil, because it is that same force, but it is intentional and it is chosen and it is coming from a human being who has moral agency. But the badness of the event doesn't come down to a human being, it comes down to the act of force. And I know that the word force can seem like, because it doesn't have that same kind of like psychological value as something like saying arson or murder or something like that, right? Or saying, this is bad because it causes suffering. But suffering comes out of that umbrella term of force, in the sense that suffering is when you are made to act for, or you are made to act for the sake of something that you do not value. So all suffering comes out of some kind of force, whether that's existential force or that is human force. All suffering, all badness comes out of some experience of force, whether it comes from nature or whether it comes from human beings. But while the badness of force from the existential or from nature is just bad, the force that comes from human beings we call evil because it's chosen and there's moral agency to it. It is deliberate in one way or another. And not only that, but what undergirds the fact that one submits to force is the precondition of life. Meaning, well, it's partially the precondition of life, but it is the precondition of life, right? It's like, why do you submit to nature, right? Why do you submit to the need of survival and perpetuation? Well, because only values can be made manifest within life. So the threat of death from nature, if you don't do the things that you need to do in order to survive, the threat of death from nature is not really death. You're not really afraid of death in and of itself. You are afraid of meaninglessness. You are afraid of the cessation or the complete inability to manifest what it is that you actually value. Because values can only be manifested within life. If you're dead, you can't have meaning. If you're dead, you can't have purpose. If you're dead, you can't manifest values. You can't do what you want because you're no longer alive. And in the same way, when somebody uses force against you, especially threats of force, what motivates you to comply with that person's threats of force is the underlying threat of death, right? So if someone tries to rob you and they threaten your life in some way or another, if you had no fear of death, then you wouldn't care whether or not they were going to harm you bodily or threaten your life. You would just continue to do. If you were immortal and someone tried to rob you, you would just walk away and it wouldn't matter what they did. You wouldn't give them the wallet, right? You wouldn't give them your money. It's because they are threatening you with the cessation of meaning and purpose and values that you give them your wallet. So the threat of force is really the threat of death. And the threat of death is really the threat of nothingness, the threat of meaninglessness, the threat of valuelessness. And that in the threat of force by a human being. And the actual act of force by a human being, like in the case of the arsonist, is just the actual manifestation of a non-value, right? Again, being forced to act in a way that you don't value. If someone commits arson and burns down your house, you are forced to not live within that house anymore. But if we lived forever, and if force was never used against us, then we would live very differently than we often do. We would live more authentically. Why? Because we wouldn't be changing our behavior based on what we need to do to secure the preconditions for authenticity. We would just be acting authentically on what we value automatically. If nobody could hurt us and we couldn't die, we would be far more authentic in our behavior than we are now. The things that get in the way are death, the needs of survival, and threats from other human beings, which are both the same in terms of badness because they both create that inauthenticity, but also are different in the sense that the natural force is bad, but the human force is evil. So the most concrete example I can give of this that most people can relate to is like a job. Now there are some people, and this is a modern Western example, but there are some people who they can work a job that is really the fulfillment of what they value, right? It doesn't, they're not working. I mean, they get a benefit of making money from the job that they do, but they have the benefit of being able to work a job that is authentically of value to them, while making the money and the resources necessary to survive in the world, right? And then there are those, and this is the vast majority of us, who have to work a job that is not really of authentic value to us, but we do in order to secure resources, in order to secure, again, in the West, money so that we can pay for the things that we need. And we do this in the hope and the expectation that we will be able to gather enough resources so that at some other point we can do the things that actually have value to us. But the degree of time and energy and resources that we are forced to put into our survival is the degree that we are unable to act for the sake of what we truly value. Because we are wrapped up in the means to authenticity. And of course, a life that is completely wrapped up in the means to authenticity is a life that never actually reaches for authenticity. But work, at least in an ideal society, not necessarily in the society that we live in, but work is at the very least a voluntary arrangement. It's voluntary in the sense of human to human, right? The fact that we have to do things in order to survive, labor to survive, is an existential force, not a human force. And a voluntary market exchange is a is reflective of the existential force of the fact that we need to labor in order to survive, and not an expression of human on human moral agent force. So there's that degree in which there is an innate inauthenticity in existing itself that has nothing to do with whether or not humans are using force against one another. There is just the fact that we have to restrict what we do. We have to restrict the authenticity of what we're doing in order to meet the preconditions for life that is necessary in order to pursue authenticity. And we can sort of do things positively in order to reduce that time. Much of technology and markets are aimed towards this. But ultimately, the root cause goes back to an existential limitation, not a human, an artificial expectation. And again, this is within an ideal forceless society. We live in a force-based society, and that makes things distinct. So there is a lot of what humans are doing right now, both in terms of the state and the market, that reduce one's ability to be authentic. But we'll get into that maybe a little bit later. And I think this is um, what's most important to point out about this is that there's a solid sort of existential limitation on authenticity. We cannot have full authenticity because at some level, in some way, we have to restrict and change ourselves in order to survive. We have to go away from what we actually value and sacrifice time, energy, resources, and behavior to satisfy the conditions for life itself, right? And this is not a problem that we can ultimately or categorically solve. There's always going to be some extent into which we are limited in acting for the sake of what we truly value because of the limitations of existence itself. But more importantly, there are so many different kinds of artificial human limitations and social limitations that come into play to restrict our authenticity and what we can act for the sake of. And at the end of the day, they're actually all unified by the same kind of motivation that we'll get into. But the main drivers that undergird every kind of artificial human force is the threat of death and the fact that one is physically either the threat of death or that one is quite literally physically forced to act in a way that is against one's values. Honestly, each one could probably take its own, could have its own video, is what I would say. But I want to do I want to try to do at least a brief overview. I'm sort of just getting some practice in anyway. So, but the first one the first one that is, I guess, closer to my own concern is that of childhood. Because a child exists in a very unique relationship to parents and into wider society, but more closely to parents than anything. Of course, one of the things that enables the use of physical force and the threat of death is power. My degree of power over you is my ability to get you to do the things that I want to. And the majority of power comes from the ability to threaten and carry through on threats. We can kind of see this with the state. The state is able to threaten you if you do not follow whatever laws or dictates it wants to give you, and it can follow through on that threat. And that's why people follow the law, essentially. People follow the law because they are threatened if they don't follow the law. And they know that the state has the capacity to actually follow through on the threat. The state threatens force and is capable of following through on force. And so people comply with it in order to avoid force. But there's a situation with a child and the parent that's very similar, if not the actual root of state violence or state force, where the child is born and there is a massive, massive power disparity between the parent and the child. The parent has unlimited and immediate power over the child, intellectually, physically, emotionally, in terms of knowledge, on every metric that you can pretty much think of. The parent has unrivaled capacity and power over the child. And even more importantly than this is the perspective of the child. Meaning that even if you live in a place that values children's rights and has protections in place for them, the child has no real understanding of that, let alone the ability to actually reach out for help. What they know is their parents. And what they know, whether explicitly or not, is that their parents are their source of not only survival, but not only their survival as a child, but this sort of storehouse of resources, skills, knowledge, and socialization that are necessary to survive in the future. Parents are these gods in the eyes of their children because they are so powerful and because they are the source of life. And children, of course, depend on their parents for absolutely everything. Again, not only life itself, but all the skills necessary for life in the future. I talked about how we as adults act differently than we might otherwise do because of our needs for survival, right? We orient our lives around what we perceive as necessary to survive. I go to a job and work that job and perform in that job so that I can get what I need in order to survive day to day, right? Who I am at work, right, is not necessarily who I really am. The things that I'm pursuing at work are not necessarily correlated to what I authentically value, right? What do I change my behavior and I change what I'm after when I'm working because it serves as this universal necessary means to the end of having time to be authentic at some point. And children don't have jobs, but children have a source of survival, which is their parents. And they will change and modify themselves in order to secure that survival. Children have another way of putting this is that children become whatever they need to become in order to get what they need from their parents. And depending on how parents model their relationship with their children, children can change who they are drastically in order to get these needs met. Again, it depends on how much power is actually exercised by the parent. But the universal characteristic is that, and this is kind of no matter how good the parents are, because this is part of the evolution of child psychology, you could say. And at some point, we'll get into the history of that because that does a lot of the explanatory power. But I'm just sort of talking about the basics here. For many children out there, they have to become very different from what they sort of instinctually are in order to get their parents' love and care, in order to enable them to survive. And because the parents have almost absolute control over the child's existence and they are so astronomically more powerful than the child, they can force the child to change themselves quite dramatically. Meaning, if the child didn't have to change themselves in order to get the parents' love and care, then they would manifest themselves much more authentically than they would if they had to change who they are and how they behave and what they want in order to satisfy their parents enough to receive love and care from them. And right now, we're not talking about the value of the virtues of socialization, because it's just too much to kind of get into. I'm just trying to underline the I guess the psychological dynamics that are going on here, right? So, a concrete example I like to give is if Timmy is born on a farm, right? And what Timmy really wants to be, what he's really interested in doing is being an artist. Like he loves to draw or something, right? Or he just has this really artistic sense. He's very creative. But Timmy's dad needs him to work on the farm with him, right? And so everything that Timmy's dad does in terms of intellectual manipulation, in terms of showing affection, and in terms of what he forces Timmy to do has to do with him working on the farm, right? If he does a good job working on the farm, he gets praise, he gets extra food, he gets privileges, right? But if he's off, drawing snails in the sand, then his dad yells at him or punishes him in some way. The father uses his power to mold the child into doing what he wants by threats, by withholding affection, which for the child are essentially the same thing, and by using his power to force the child to become what the father wants him to become rather than whatever the child authentically is or naturally is without the father using force or threats or manipulation. And again, there's a whole moral debate about whether or not that's good or bad, right? And we'll get into that, but I'm just trying to lay out the dynamics here, right? The child, because of the position they're in, both because of their powerlessness on the one hand and their need, their source of survival coming from their parents, and whether their parents are what the conditions they need to meet for the parents in order to receive love and care. Because of these two dynamics, the child, whoever the child is naturally or authentically, becomes greatly shaped, greatly manipulated, and greatly changed in both behavior and thought based on what the parents um, force or manipulate the child to become. And parents do this in both subtle and not so subtle ways. And not only that, but even if the parent is very, very deliberate about giving the child as much freedom as possible, the child, again, because of evolutionary reasons that we might get into in maybe a second part of this video, the child is heavily motivated to become whatever gets the affection and the care of the parent. Now, there's tensions there. It's not absolute. There are children who are more, you could say, rebellious than other children, or some children who are more willing to take risks with their own authenticity compared or take risks with their care for the sake of authenticity than others. But every child must sit in this zone where they are getting enough love and care from their parents so that they can survive. And survival coming from the needs of the parents necessarily shapes who the child becomes, not authentically, but in terms of their needs for survival. And the child is sort of doing this automatically. The child is not trying to shape their personality necessarily. It is, it's a psychoevolutionary reaction. But nonetheless, the understanding of the self and the behavior of the self changes in relationship to the parents, right? The underlying authentic personality does not go away. It gets covered over. It gets repressed. It gets discarded. It gets put somewhere to where it's not going to endanger the child's access to love and care. Now, respect for the child's individuality is something that is incredibly modern, as in has really at best come about in the last 300 years maybe, and really hasn't gained momentum until maybe the 50s, and maybe even worse than that, the 70s. We're talking about the earliest declaration of the child's right to be a child comes from Janusz Korczak, who wrote during World War II, and I guess the advocacy of the child's authentic self really only comes about in the 70s and 80s with Alice Miller. So it's a very to actually respect the child's authentic self is a very recent phenomena, all other things being considered. And there is an entire, but the point is to say that the farther you go back in history, the more and more there is this deliberate structuring of the child's behavior, thoughts, and emotions so that they conform with whatever the expectations or needs of, in particular, the parents are. And the child submits to this ultimately in order to maintain their own survival, to get the love and the care that they need in order to survive in the world, because survival is a precondition for authenticity. There's no point in being authentic if it's going to get you killed. So you will repress your authenticity in the hopes that later down the line you can be authentic. And this happens between the child and the parent almost at an instinctual level. The parents don't even necessarily know what they're doing, and a lot of times it's justified on the auspices. It's justified under the title of socialization, that the child needs to be socialized. And again, we'll get into the moral debate about it. I sort of just want to talk about I'm sort of just here talking about the psychological dynamics that are going on between the parent and the child. There is a similar thing that's happening between the citizen and the state. But this video has already gotten to an hour. And so I think we're just going to leave it here and continue to plow on next time. So Again, I appreciate you if you've gotten this far in listening to the video. I'm going to continue to keep practicing, continuing to keep articulating the philosophy as best I can, and trying to work on it becoming more clear. But again, this is mostly an attempt to get over the fear of talking about it and get the practice of articulating the philosophy verbally itself. So there are going to be ups and downs and bumps and roads, but it's really just part of a more generally authentic project in and of itself. So again, I appreciate you listening if you made it this far, and talk to you next time.